By early 1943, the harsh battlefields of North Africa revealed an uncomfortable truth the Allied command could no longer ignore. Fuel, the lifeblood of modern warfare, was vanishing before it ever reached the fighting units. A massive shipment of 70,000 gallons would leave a rear depot, only for barely 30,000 to reach the front. Nearly 60% simply disappeared into the desert. Shockingly, supply officers called these results acceptable. This was not an isolated incident. It was a window into a much larger failure that had been unfolding since the earliest days of the war. The Allies weren't losing fuel to enemy action. They were losing it to their own equipment. And the tragic irony, the perfect solution had already existed for years. But an invisible design change made by American engineers transformed a brilliant German invention into a costly disaster. A desert problem NOONE could ignore. In September 1942, American chemical engineer Richard M. Daniel arrived in Egypt under urgent orders from the War Department. Rumors of catastrophic fuel losses at the front were spreading fast. But no one in Washington imagined just how severe the situation truly was. When Daniel arrived, reality hit him like a blast furnace. British supply units reported that as much as 1/3 to nearly half of all transported gasoline evaporated, leaked, or spilled before they could deliver it to their armored divisions. War correspondent Alan Moorhead summed up the crisis bluntly when he wrote that British forces were stuck relying on flimsy 4-gallon tins that usually started to smell like gasoline after an hour or two of desert driving. These containers, nicknamed flimsies by frustrated troops, were built from thin sheet metal, held together by soldered seams that split with the slightest abuse. They crushed easily, cracked when the temperature rose, and leaked steadily simply from being transported. Many were packed in fragile cardboard boxes or cheap plywood cases, making them barely usable after a single journey. The British were bleeding fuel faster than they could haul it, but American containers didn't fare much better. The U.S. Army relied on outdated World War I-style cans. Heavy, rectangular, awkward to pour, sealed with screw caps that had cork gaskets prone to degrading. They needed funnels, wrenches, and often 2 men to handle properly. They certainly weren't designed for the brutal conditions of Saharan warfare. Daniel watched helplessly as fuel trickled into the sand at supply points. Every drop wasted meant tanks running dry in combat, convoys stalled miles from battle, and entire operations vulnerable. He estimated a shocking 40% loss rate and sent an urgent message to Washington hoping to provoke action. Later, Daniel would admit that the figure was partly an educated guess, but still nowhere near the worst documented realities. German cans. The unseen advantage. While the Allies fought their own containers, German supply units experienced no such chaos. Whenever Allied soldiers captured Axis fuel dumps, they were stunned to discover German cans that looked almost brand new even after months of hard use. These green metal containers, soon known universally as jerrycans, were so reliable that Allied troops began hoarding them. Elite units like the Long-Range Desert Group ditched British flimsies entirely in favor of captured German cans. The Germans had cracked the code years earlier. Their fuel container, formerly called the Einheitskanister, was the brainchild of engineer Vincent Grünvogel at the Muller engineering firm. Development began in the mid-1930s, and after rigorous testing, including 5,000 prototypes issued to troops for field trials, the German military officially adopted the design in 1937. By the outbreak of war, the Wehrmacht had stockpiles ready, and these cans became a key element behind the rapid, mechanized blitzkrieg across Europe. The brilliance of the design lay in details the Allies failed to appreciate. Each can held 20 liters, about 5.3 US gallons, and was made of 2 stamped steel halves welded together with a recessed, X-pattern seam. That weld made the structure incredibly tough while also allowing for expansion and contraction as fuel heated or cooled. The can featured triple handles for flexible carrying, a built-in air channel allowing smooth pouring without glugging, a quick-release cam lever cap requiring no tools, an interior anti-corrosion coating, indented strengthening ribs that prevented deformation. Every element had a purpose. Every detail was battle-tested. The result? A container that didn't leak, didn't rupture, poured quickly, stacked perfectly, and survived extreme heat and cold. It was so effective that the design became classified by Germany during the war. US tries TO copy, AND fails. In a strange twist of fate, an American engineer named Paul Pleiss encountered the German cans as early as 1939 while working with a German colleague. Realizing their brilliance, he shipped samples to the United States, but the US military dismissed the idea, either out of bureaucratic inertia, skepticism of foreign designs, manufacturing concerns, or simply arrogance. Eventually, the Quartermaster Corps began evaluating the design. They measured it. They photographed it. They studied every feature. And then, fatally, they altered one invisible detail. American engineers kept the outer shape, the handles, and even the general construction. But instead of using the strong welded seams that made the German cans virtually indestructible, they switched to rolled seams, which were cheaper and easier to mass produce. This decision would haunt Allied logistics. Rolled seams weakened whenever metal expanded and contracted in desert heat, forming tiny gaps too small to notice but large enough for fuel to seep through consistently. The Americans also removed or simplified the built-in air channel in some models, making pouring slower and more cumbersome. Some versions lacked the protective internal coating of the original German cans. The US cans were lighter, yes, but they were also leakers, especially when filled with gasoline under high heat. Fuel seeped out invisibly from tens of thousands of cans. Add them together, and the losses became staggering. By late 1942, Allied supply officers categorized container quality as follows. 1. Best. Captured German jerrycans. 2. 3. Acceptable. British made welded copies after 1943. 4. 5. Usable only when necessary. American rolled seam cans. 6. 7. Almost useless. British flimsies. 8. The American cans failed for the same reason the British flimsies failed. Heat, expansion, and weak seams. All because a single invisible engineering change was made for convenience. Turning point. Britain fixes what America WOII. After Daniel sounded the alarm, the War Department couldn't ignore the crisis. Tanks running empty during combat operations made the problem impossible to hide. But instead of correcting the American design, the solution came from Britain. In 1943, British factories began producing meticulous, faithful copies of the German original. Fully welded seams. Correct interior lining. Proper breather tube. No shortcuts. No substitutions. These cans worked flawlessly. By early 1943, 2 million British-made jerrycans were shipped to North Africa. By 1944, production expanded to the Middle East and Europe. While America continued producing its flawed version, Britain's welded jerrycans became indispensable in nearly every theater of war. The importance of jerrycans was staggering. A single 2.5-ton truck could carry 875 gallons of fuel and cans alone, and half of all wartime logistics by weight consisted of petroleum products. In fact, during the rapid Allied pursuit across France in 1944, the limiting factor wasn't fuel, it was cans. Millions disappeared along the route, abandoned, repurposed as makeshift chairs, sidewalks, and construction material. or simply misplaced. By October 1944, over 3.5 million American cans were missing. By May 1945, the military estimated they needed nearly 20 million jerrycans to sustain operations in Europe. President Roosevelt himself remarked that without jerrycans, the lightning-fast Allied advance across France would have been impossible. The lessons written and fuel and sand. The exact amount of fuel lost specifically due to American rolled seam cans will never be fully known. The government documented little, perhaps intentionally, but the consequences were undeniable. Fuel absorbed by desert sand. Supply delays. Vehicles stranded. Operations slowed. Soldiers preferring enemy equipment over their own. All because the U.S. attempted to copy a design without understanding the science behind it. The German engineers had perfected every element because they understood that details determine survival. The Americans imitated the outer form, but stripped away the structural heart. In the end, the Allies learned the hard way that when it comes to engineering, especially in war, you cannot cut corners on the things no one sees. Post-war standards finally mandated welded seams, effectively abandoning the flawed American approach. Today's NATO standard 20-liter jerry can is still almost identical to the German 1937 version. Nearly a century later, the design remains unmatched. Teach final message. The story of the jerrycan is more than a tale about fuel containers. It's a lesson in engineering humility. It shows how small design choices can shape the fate of armies. Bureaucratic pride can blind institutions to superior ideas. A perfect design can be ruined by altering just one unseen feature. And how refusing to respect the details can cost lives, resources, and victory. The German jerrycan endures because every line, every weld, every groove was crafted with purpose. It survived the war. It survived the decades. It remains a global standard. The American rolled seam version survives only as a cautionary relic, a reminder that good enough is never good enough when the world depends on your engineering.